Welcome, everyone, to the NEANE lecture series. This initiative is a result of a collaboration between NEANE, the Center for the Study of Non-European Art at the University of Campinas, Unicamp, and the SMFA Tufts. And we have the support of the Getty Foundation through their Connecting Art Histories program. Before we introduce our very distinguished guest this evening, as usual, just one reminder, you can send your comments and questions through the comment section on YouTube. Thank you. Claudia, can you please present our guest?
Okay, boa noite, good night everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and with my good colleague, Professor Kelli Morgan. I will present her quickly then before she starts. Dr. Kelli Morgan is a curator, educator, and social justice activist who specializes in American art and visual culture. Her scholarly commitment to the investigation of anti-Blackness within those fields has demonstrated how traditional art history and museum practice work specifically to uphold white supremacy. Besides her own curatorial experience, she mentors students, emerging curators, and regularly trains staffs at various museums to foster anti-racist approaches to collection building, exhibitions, community engagement, and fundraising. Over the past 2 years, Dr. Morgan has become a leading and influential voice, bolstering anti-racist work in art museums. Currently, she is a professor of practice and an inaugural director of curatorial studies at Tufts University. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Kelli Morgan. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's really wonderful. I'm so excited. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And I am really thankful and appreciative for the invitation. I know for this particular forum, you all really discuss non-European art. My talk tonight is going to be a little different, and then I'll be discussing non-European curatorial strategies. The way I've utilized them, throughout my career, particularly in one of the most recent, experiences I had during my time as the associate curator of American art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. So when I don't know what the conversation is, I'm not totally versed with what the conversation is in Brazil or across South America, right, in terms of the diversity in institutions. But in the States, there's a lot of conversation right now about diversity and equity and inclusion, but nobody really knows, particularly the large art museums, right? It's like nobody's really defined those terms. There isn't necessarily, in my experience, I guess I shouldn't say across the board, but there isn't necessarily a direction, right? It's like everybody knows it's something that we should do, but nobody necessarily knows how to do it, right? And art museums are not actually structured for it, right? The other thing that we have an issue with in the States is we like to say race and racism. We don't like to say white supremacy, right? Because that triggers, this idea of the Ku Klux Klan and, racial violence, which is a form, right, of white supremacy. But it prevents, I think, an overall understanding, right, of structural racism, systemic racism, right? How white supremacy exists in various forms, right? And there's an array. So then there's someone like me, who walks into an institution as a critical race cultural historian, right? As an anti-racist scholar, who can kind of explain, right, or implement the differences between DEI work, anti-racist work, and abolition work. And unbeknownst to me, as I started my curatorial career, it took me a minute, to realize that institutions were often, talking the talk, but couldn't walk the walk. So whenever I would come into an institution, next slide, I would start with this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's from his pretty much, I think, the most well-known work, that he wrote in 1903, called The Souls of Black Folks. And in the States, Du Bois was probably the most prolific Black scholar, of the 20th century. And I'll wait, I know technical difficulties happen, but I want to read the slide to you.
Yeah. Just a second, because the slide is not moving for us. Yeah, here you go.
Okay, there it goes.
Thank you.
So in this piece, in Souls of Black Folk, he's talking about like the way that Black Americans can kind of see America for what it really is, coupled with the fact, right, that we know and we can see America for what it claims itself to be. So he says, between me and the other world, there is an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. But to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. And this quote is really important to me because throughout my career, the question was always, how did you get here? Right? What are you doing here? Because as, again, an anti-racist curator, my approach was I was always approaching the problem from the root, which discomforted tons of people, all the time. And it was fascinating to me that, almost 100 years later, actually over 100 years later, this was still a thing, that, for I think 20th century or 21st century questions in that way, it's like when the kind of like liberal white American comes up to you and says, I voted for Obama, right? And I can't tell you how many art parties I've been to where that was like the first thing somebody said because they really didn't know what to say because I was the only Black person in the room, right? And so it's this discomfort. And what I realized was that my career, over the last 8 years has been this series, of institutional upheavals from doing this work because the work is so inherently disruptive, right? Because white supremacy is so inherently foundational to art museum structures. Next slide. So when I started at the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Newfields, I did a similar presentation, started with this quote, because the institution was at this point of like, literally hiring me to diversify the collection, right? And to diversify our curatorial approach across the board to exhibitions and programs. We worked in what was called a core team model. So the curator was very purposely decentered. So it was a group effort, whenever we brought exhibitions or programs, to fruition, there was representatives from every department, involved in the core team process. There were this whole lot of steps, but it was a way to kind of equalize, right, the exhibition programmatic process, so that everybody had a say, right, that everybody could contribute to a show in some kind of way. And so an example I can give you is that like you could maybe be a guest services staff member, right, but if you had a great idea that contributed to like a learning model or module, for the end of an exhibition, you could design that module, right? And not necessarily be on the education team, or in interpretation or a curator. So it gave most of the staff or the majority of the staff the same kind of stake, in an exhibition than most institutions, right, are traditionally used to. And it was fabulous. When I got there, I was like, oh, this is great, because most institutions, particularly large art museums in the States, the departments are very siloed. It's really hard, to work across departments. And part of my curatorial practice was really building, cross-departmental coalitions and collectivity, which again, I ran into a lot of issues. You usually, in my experience, museum leadership doesn't really like that, type of work. So it was to come to a place where that was what the staff was already doing, and there was a structure for it, and there was a process and a policy for it. I was like, this is great. However, next slide. Again, there was a lot of conversation about diversity, and diversifying our audiences. And if you know anything about the state of Indiana, in terms of United States history, it is actually, the Ku Klux Klan is actually headquartered in the state of Indiana. It's a really problematic state in terms of gender politics, sexuality politics, racial politics, you name it. And there's a process called redlining that happens all over the states. That is like I don't know if I would call it silent per se, but it's like a quote unquote like invisible form of segregation, right? In terms of who can buy homes where, right? How different neighborhoods are, funded in terms of taxes going to the school systems, all this kind of things. And so this is how ghettos are created, in the United States. So the 38th Newfield sat on the corner of 38th Street and what was MLK and Michigan Road. So these are not great pictures, but imagine, so you're like sitting in front of your computer, right? So imagine that you're actually sitting in your car at an intersection, right? So you're sitting at a traffic light. On one side of the street, was Newfield, so where you see the sign and the red truck. On the other side of the street was Crown Hill Funeral Home, right? And it literally formed like this gate. And 38th Street in Indianapolis was the hard red line, in the city between white and black and between the haves and the have-nots. So very little Black people live north, or people of color actually live north of 38th Street, right? So much so that the street name changed. So on the south side of 38th Street, right, it's called MLK Boulevard. On the north side of the street, it's called Michigan Road, right? So there's this linguistic, geographical marcation. So it was really just like, don't pass go, don't create, don't collect $200 if you're a Monopoly player. Way of telling people of color, telling working class people, right, telling lower class people to stay out. And so it was this whole idea of like, we're going to diversify the museum audience. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, we first have to deal with where we are in the city. How do we combat, geographical racism? The museum literally like represents. So that ruffled a little bit of feathers. People were just like, oh my God, like, I can't, basically, because it's something that people knew in Indianapolis, but people didn't say out loud, right? So I was speaking out of turn in certain cases. And I said, okay, I'm to be careful about that. I'll see, I'll throw that pebble out there and kind of let that ripple. Next slide. So, and what I'm kind of walking you all through is what I call my temperature taking, right? I'll take the temperature of an institution. So again, institutions that say, right, they want to do the work. It's like, how prepared, are you for this work to happen? So this is the one of the front galleries of the American wing. I was sort of charged, right, with the entire American wing. And so there's this large Georgia O'Keeffe, that you see that I think is probably on the right side of your screen, just like it's on the right side of mine. And I had a collector in Philly who had a piece by Barclay Hendricks called Dr. Cool, which is the piece that you see way in the back of a Black man, like all in white. And Barclay was a dear friend of mine, but also a really important, 20th century American artist. And he worked, in figurative realism, but in monochromatic tones. So when I left Philadelphia and the collector said, I really want to loan this work, I said, oh, I have a perfect place for it. Right? So I'm going to put it in the Modernism Gallery because the O'Keeffe was the center of the gallery. It's a major piece because it's one of her Jemison weave pieces, but it's the only one with 4 blooms. And it's also the one that was commissioned by Elizabeth Arden, like the cosmetics magnate, right, for her Fifth Avenue salon. So it's a blockbuster piece, that people come and see. And I said, okay, I'm gonna put this Black man, in this gallery, right? Kind of, I hate to say it, in O'Keeffe's shadow, right? But again, to kind of disrupt, the prestige, maybe is the word to use, of like O'Keeffe's presence here. And O'Keeffe is one of my favorite American artists, but it was really like, how do I kind of slice through the whiteness, that is so present in this gallery? Next slide. So these are some installation shots that like I'll go through. This is a piece. This is a up close piece, because Hendricks worked from photography, and he was very much so about the everyday, Black person, right? So people he would just kind of meet on the street that he found interesting, his cousins, family members, elevating, these people to a space of reverence, that they, as they were, right, as they looked going to work, as they looked going to church, right, as they looked in their everyday lives, was worthy of American portraiture at a large scale, right? So a lot of the paintings, are really large. Dr. Cool is really interesting because this particular figure is actually not a doctor. He was a pastor, and we have, this saying in the Black community of like jackleg preachers, or like street corner preachers. And he was one of those figures. And it's just a really, important piece. And you can actually find the photo like actually still in auction. Next slide. So with that, I also, another collector reached out to me and said that they had a Richard Hunt sculpture. And Richard Hunt, another Black male American artist, probably, I would say between him and Mel Edwards, is like the one of the only living abstract Black sculptors, still alive today, and actually still making work. Richard is in his late 80s, mid to late 80s. So going back to this sort of like magnificence of this gallery, and I was like, oh, I can get a huge pedestal and put this Richard Hunt in there. So I do that. Next slide. And come to this really interesting way that the Hunt is centered in like one of the walkways, right? Kind of perpendicular to the O'Keeffe. But these 3 in the back, so you see the Barclay Hendricks, there's a little small sculpture on a pedestal back there. That's a Sergeant Johnson, also alone, also a Black male sculptor. He was a Harlem Renaissance artist. Next to the painting, next to the Barclay Hendricks is this painting that you can't really see very well, but that's a Jacob Lawrence. And it was also a really famous, a really popular, piece with guests because it was an image of like a tie rack, right? And like an old like shoe. I don't know if you guys remember these things, but like in the 80s and the 70s, there were these old plastic like shoe racks that you hung on the back of your closet. And it's an image of that, but he abstracts it. So it was a way, right, that Black and again, working class Americans could come to abstraction through just a very everyday piece of clothing, right? And just like this sort of utilitarian piece in their homes. This was a type of piece that every Black family, grandparents, aunts, uncles had in their houses. So I was like, okay, let me see if people kind of get that. And it was a hit. People loved Dr. Cool. People were like, oh my God, because the galleries don't change that much in in US art museums, permanent collection galleries pretty much stay the same for years. So it was a huge shift. And people really noticed. And whenever I would say, like, yeah, those pieces are all by Black male artists, and they would go, oh my gosh. So I was like, okay, that works. And it's bringing, word travels, right? So Indianapolis is kind of like a big, small town. So people were like, there's a new American art curator, at the museum. There's a space, in the American galleries where she has these, these pieces by, Black artists on view, like all in one space. Because the museum, to give the museum credit, there was work by Black artists, all around, but it hadn't necessarily been, you wouldn't know, right, unless you actually knew the artists. And these were new pieces, even though they weren't new acquisitions, they were loans, right? Temporary loans, but it sent a message, that there was a different presence in the gallery. Next slide. So that began, to catch on. I began to actually do talks to introduce people to Richard and Barclay. Richard is the artist on the left-hand side of your screen. Barclay is the artist on the right. Barclay actually passed away. Richard lived in Chicago, so Richard actually came to visit. So it was like, again, just introducing, the Indianapolis community, to this artist that was, right up the way that they could really, go and see his work and actually hear from him, So I kind of let that marinate, within the institution, as well as within the community. Next slide. And then I set my sights on something a little more discomforting. And this is the Rotunda Gallery. Right off, it's also a part of the American wing. It was a very sacred space in the institution. It's really anchored by a Tiffany window, which I'll get into in a minute. But a lot of prayer happened in this space, right? Yoga, as you see, happened in this space every Saturday morning. And it was a very Indiana specific space. So the piece on the far left is a piece by Robert Grohl. That was a 19th century scene of downtown Indianapolis. The piece in the back that you can't really see that well is a white female sitter. The painter was Ruth Pratt Bobbs, who was one of the most important women Indiana artists, working at the beginning of the 20th century. And there were two other pieces that are actually on the from the vantage point that we are sitting in right now that aren't in the picture. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna disrupt this space primarily, next slide, because I kept thinking, as I kept walking through the space, and I would notice, walking through this space with my Muslim students, walking through this space with my Asian students, walking through this space with Black students, from across the Indianapolis public school system. And it was always this kind of tense, or they would shut down, right? And I was like, okay, there's energy, right, going on here. And I started asking, around some of the docents, right, just around the institution. And I started saying, has anybody actually done anything about how white the Rotunda Gallery is? And it was silence. You could just hear a pin drop. And eventually, somebody said, well, why would you ask that question? And I said, well, have you ever walked through that gallery with a group of people of color? Have you ever walked through that gallery with people who aren't Christian? Did you ever think to yourselves that maybe it's not as welcoming as you think it is? And no one had ever asked those questions, right? Let alone actually unpack them. So for me, it was well, how can, I as a curator, or my colleagues as curators, activate permanent collections through methodologies that address those issues, right? That address how the normalization, of whiteness, right? Of the white body, particularly white femaleness, and even Christianity, right? Can be a type and can function, right? In service to systemic racism, or to white supremacy? How do we unpack that? And then subsequently, right, create new ways forward. Next slide. So from there, I decided to what I call excavate. So I started to excavate these two pieces. This is The Angel of Resurrection by William Comfort Tiffany, who was a major glass designer and artist, painter. He's really well known for, again, stained glass windows, clearly. But he made these lamps, stained glass lamps that sold, so very popular, right, in stores. William McGregor Paxson is also a really famous early 20th century American painter, but this nude is not his typical style, right? And it was, when I said there were two other paintings from the vantage point, that we're sitting in that you couldn't see in the gallery, this is one of them. And I just found it fascinating because Indy definitely had that whole issue, right, about male frontal nudity, but not so much, right, with the white female body, because it's elevated in a particular way. Next slide. So the idea, like the narrative around the Tiffany window in the relationship, right, between these two pieces, was that the window, and this is actually true, the window was commissioned by Benjamin Harrison's wife upon his death. Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd president of the United States. He was also a son of Indianapolis, from Indiana, served, in the Union Army during the Civil War, and is really hailed, as a hero, right, of Indy. The thing that they don't really tell you, not just the museum, but history in and of itself, about Benjamin Harrison's time in office, is that lynching in the southern United States, actually across the United States, was at its highest during his presidency. So I took it upon myself to bring that little tidbit of history to light. Because when we think about Tiffany, as a design studio, as a American artist that's literally like manufacturing, artwork, not just for collectors, but for commercial reasons. We're talking about the manufacturing and the industrialization, of the northern cities. What's happening in the southern half of the country that's allowing that industrialization to happen? That something is Jim Crow segregation. The crux of that Jim Crow segregation is the political terror and lynching that is going on and happening to not Black, races and brutes, and crazies and Sambos and Uncle Toms, as the stereotypes would have you believe. It's happening to Black business owners and Black landowners and Black teachers, right? And Black people who are literally moving up the economic ladder themselves in the best ways that they can, right? The point of Jim Crow segregation was to reinscribe slavery by another name. And that other name is Jim Crow. They needed, Northern industrialists needed a new labor force. And you had all of these, again, quote unquote, dangerous Black men roam in the South. And so it was very much so a political directive, right? It was a strategy. So Tiffany isn't just making this artwork just willy-nilly because he's just such a great artist. He's making this artwork because there's an economic phenomenon that's happening from the South, fueling, right, Northern industry that allows him to do it, that is literally circumscribing and killing, right, Black people. Now, the Harrisons benefit, I guess, he did help, many immigrating, Black families who were coming from the South, to Indiana, for better lives at the time. It was something that he didn't publicize, of course, right? But he did help, many Black families sort of relocate in Indiana. and across Indianapolis. Next slide. So in my mind, I was just like, why is this not in the label copy, right, anywhere? The other thing that was really interesting about this Tiffany window was it is, the Archangel Michael, at the resurrection of Christ, right? So he has this horn, but he's also in this chainmail suit, like a knight. And in 1903, 1904, there was only one organization that utilized knight iconography. This is the state of Indiana. That, whether art historians, right, previous curators, even Tiffany Studios, right, wanted to admit that or not, this chainmail knight iconography here is a direct visual message to the Ku Klux Klan, right? And the whole idea is like, well, it's actually, I should say the narrative. It's like, oh, it's actually in reference to Harrison's, time during the Union Army. He never, Harrison was never in combat, right, during his time in the Union Army. So I'm like, yeah, no, that ain't what that is. That's not what that is. But okay, I'll give y'all that. So next slide. So that was one, part of the excavation. The other part in applying a critical race lens is that the Paxson is glazed, which means it has like a sheet of glass, right, over the top of it. So when you look at it, it really reflects Archangel Michael, literally off this female nude's body. What was the reasoning for lynching across the US? It was a lie. It was a fictive reason, right? But the reasoning was always this protection of white womanhood, right? This protection of white femininity, this ethereal white femininity that was almost angelic, that was very confining to white women, right? Right, and very abusive, to white women too. So it's this white, racist, patriarchal, right, male imaginary that's happening. So I'm in the space, and I was like, all of this, is completely active, here, whether or not the labels say it. If you know the history, you can see, right, the visual cues. And we can't act like, this work is not being, artwork isn't made in a vacuum, right? It's made in the context of the time, right, that the artist is working. Paxton's piece was painted in 1907. Next slide. So with that, as luck would have it, I have a lot of nice collectors, right? A collector comes to me again and he says, hey, Kelli, I have this Robert Colescott moving, losing wall space. Can I loan it, long-term loan it? And I said, sure. And I hadn't seen it at first. And I said, which painting is it? And he said, it's the Saint Sebastian. And I was like, oh, sweet. And he said, where are you going to put it? And this particular collector from Milwaukee, but had taught at IU for a number of years. So he was familiar, right, with the Rotunda Gallery. So I was like, I'm going to put it in the Rotunda. And he was like, oh my God, Pete. He was like, you are going to I love that you're going to do that, but oh my God, that's going to ruffle so many feathers. And I was like, yeah, I know. Like, that's the point. So comes in, I put it up. Colescott's piece is really about miscegenation, right? Because he's from a mixed race family. The piece is really, using the Saint Sebastian iconography to talk about how miscegenation and lynching kills us all, right? So this is why you have a figure as Saint Sebastian that's half black male, half white woman, but noosed, right, and tied to white men and black, and a white man and a black woman. Black men were killed, right, for the alleged rape of white women, where white men raped black women in the South with impunity. And so you do have this large, mixed race population. particularly in the port towns, Mobile, Charleston, New Orleans, right? And Cole Scott, is from Louisiana. And he's saying, in 1996, this is still an issue. We've never talked about this, as a country. So the hills are on fire, right? Look at all of the bodies, that have been sacrificed because of this problem in not just US history, right? But this problem in American culture. Next slide. So for me, it was a perfect piece, to really do this excavation with this Tiffany window and this Paxson and Benjamin Harrison, to show how this wasn't something that was only unique to the turn of the 20th century, right? This is something that is still a problem. So I kind of borrowed the Whitney's title of their when the Whitney bought its new building and it redid its whole collection, America's Hard to See. And I talk about this, in the gallery didactic. The other thing that I'm also leaving out is that my colleague Anna Stein, who was the curator, works on paper, and helping me with this, or I should say working with me on this too, discovered that Tiffany actually had a glass factory in Indiana that was staffed purely and solely by child laborers, right? 1906, 1907. So, and they would bring the kids, to the museum, at certain times of the year for breaks. And so we had these tiles, that the kids made. And so she was just like, oh my God, Kelli, nobody's ever looked into any of this. And I said, yeah, and this is something you can do in pretty much any major American art museum's permanent collection. Right? You can tell these stories. They just aren't always told because they're not comfortable, right? So you can go to the next slide too. So again, I was like, I don't necessarily know how this is gonna go, but I'm gonna do it anyway. And the public, the Indianapolis community, next slide, these are just installation slides, or installation views. This was actually a local news piece about it. They ate it up. People were really hungry, for this type of interpretation. So light bulb goes off for me, and I said, we're not giving our publics enough credit at all, because it's we don't want to make people uncomfortable. People found it fabulous. Leadership at the institution, however, did not. So that was something, that was said in senior leadership meetings that was kind of being funneled back to me, because it wasn't something that they could say publicly, right? Because it was increasing membership and it was increasing visitation, right? So people were coming, particularly to see it. Next slide. People were taking note, of what not just I was doing, but what a lot of my colleagues in other areas, both curatorially as well as other areas in the institution, were doing similar work. Next slide. So we had this sort of critical mass, of workers, museum workers, who were starting to kind of radically transform the institution. And one of my favorite Angela Davis quotes is, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And you have to do it all the time. If you really believe that change is possible, you have to do it and act like it every single day. And particularly as a Black woman, we don't necessarily have a choice, right? Because as women of color, we're on the margins of the margin, and so change is necessary. Our whole existence is change, right? Because there is no space for us outside of the space that the system doesn't make space for us, right? The spaces that we exist in are the space that we create for ourselves. Next slide. So exhibition time, right? So I come around, I meet Samuel Levi Jones, who was a Black Indianapolis artist. And Sam's work, I kind of discovered it at a very perfect time in my time in Indy, because he does a similar type of excavation where he deconstructs law books and encyclopedias and various texts, to really get at, the roots and the structures of not just systemic racism, but also systemic sexism. So we did a show called Left of Center. And this is the title wall. And the guy in the back, way back here with the glasses, was my co-curator, Bryn Jackson, who was also the assistant curator of performance and audience engagement. So Bryn was doing a lot of social practice work, a lot of bringing in a lot of social justice centered artists, right? So again, like we had this kind of momentum going. Next slide. So I, myself and the exhibition designers, we really wanted to make the gallery, there's a gallery that it was in, I don't know the square footage, but it was huge. It was very voluminous. And I wanted to make it more I wanted it to have like a living room feel. So I put like Ebony magazine, and like all of these sort of, very specifically Black publications. I wanted audiences to know that what, Sam's process was a part of a tradition, of recognizing like Black humanity. That's something very specific to African-American art making. And some of the works, so the piece that you see, just kind of directly right in the middle of the image is a piece called Complex Occupation. And it's named, it takes its title from a lyric from one of Erykah Badu's really famous songs called Other Side of the Game, right? And I wrote the label copy in Black vernacular, right? For that piece and some other pieces, in the show, because I wanted Black people to not to just see themselves, but to see the way that we speak, to see the stuff that we read, right? To see the stuff that we see in our homes every day, right? In this show. Next slide. And so with that, it was a really important moment, for the institution, because it was a very different, right, kind of exhibition. The other really interesting thing about it was the first solo show of a Black Indiana artist that the institution had ever put on. It was also the first exhibition by the institution's first Black curator. Pretty big deal, you would think, right, in an institution that claims it wants to diversify its audience. But the marketing department, said directly to my face, we refuse to market the show to Black communities. And I was like, okay, no problem. I got something for that. And I didn't actually say that out loud, but that was, my response in my head. So I marketed the show myself. And I marketed it. I made, one of my colleagues who's a graphic designer made flyers. So me and my students and my friends, and we just went around the city and we just peppered, barbershops and restaurants and churches and, just with the flyer. Anybody and everybody that I knew, I gave flyers to just let the community know, that the show was happening, to introduce Black communities that weren't familiar, with Sam and his work to his work. He did a bunch of, promotion on his end as well. Actually, like us kind of fighting the institution really strained our friendship, after a while. But we did Black radio, we did all of the Black press, we did it all. And it resulted in the largest opening. I'm trying to think of the stat now, but it was like 85% of people who showed up at the opening were people of color. And it was the first time that many people of color had showed up at an IMA opening in over 5 years, right? So in my mind, I'm like, this is working. And it was. But the senior staff, again, was not happy about it working. Next slide. So this was the acquisition that kind of broke the straw that broke the camel's back. So coming into the collection, the design collection, my colleague Shelly Salem, who was or who still is the curator of design, acquired this piece by Roberto Lugo. Roberto is a Puerto Rican ceramicist, from Philly, lives in South Kensington, is a really, really dedicated, to working class Black and Latinx people. He makes his work, to not just to represent those people, but to also to kind of narrativize, right, the meaning of porcelain. This is a porcelain floor glaze, and he works in porcelain. You can see the title, right, The Explosion of Colin Kaepernick and John Brown. Most people know, Colin Kaepernick and what happened to Colin Kaepernick when he started to protest against, or in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, during his time as the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. I think a lot of people know who John Brown is too, unfortunately, in Indiana at this particular time. And this is September 2019, right? So this is the Sam show closes, and we have an acquisition meeting, and Shelly brings this up, for acquisition. So I explain, who John Brown is, and one of our major donors, who was also a board member, goes on this just ridiculous, like, racist rant about like how everything, this piece is inappropriate because Colin Kaepernick should have just been a better capitalist, right? Right. Things have gotten so much better for African Americans. Like, why do we need to show something like this? And I responded back, and I said, the reason why we need to show something like this is because Roberto is very much so commenting on what we lose when we stand up for Black humanity. John Brown lost his life. Colin Kaepernick lost his livelihood. Now we know, he had a Nike contract, like, he's straight, it's not like, he's missing a whole lot. But the point, was to say that Black humanity matters, and it needs to be represented in any and every way that we can possibly do so. I was pretty much attacked full on after speaking up in that meeting, right? Like, I had basically spoken out of turn, to one of our important donors. I was not supposed to say, what I said, despite the fact that I'm actually like a scholar in this, in this artwork, right? The artwork also represents like me, my history, right, as a Black American, and even I think myself, currently, as a Black woman, not just as a curator. And at that point, it was just kind of this all out, attack of me and anybody who supported me in the institution. So 6 months later, no, maybe about 9 months later, next slide, I resigned. And I resigned very publicly. Initially, the first thing I did was I wrote an essay called "To Bear Witness: Real Talk About White Supremacy in Art Museums Today," where I tell a lot of these stories. And then I did an actual interview, with the Indie Star about all of the things. Like, I just kind of delineated, all of the things that were like very direct racial discrimination that had not just happened to me, but that had happened to several of my colleagues, including the one senior colleague of color. We had one senior leader, of color at the institution at the time. And once the director sort of figured out, right, that person was helping us, get this work done and get this work out of here, he fired him. He didn't actually fire him. He eliminated his position, right? So he like forced him to resign, basically, just like he kind of forced me to resign. So I delineated all of that out, in this interview, with the Indie Star. And nobody really moved, the first couple of months, like maybe the first 5 to 6 months. Nobody said anything. The institution just said, oh, she's a disgruntled employee, right? Like, I was the angry Black woman. And then February, the weekend of Valentine's Day, 2021 rolls around. Next slide. And the institution puts out probably one of the most racist job descriptions you would ever see, where it's asking for it's looking, right, they're searching for their new museum director. So one, the museum director position only exists, right, because of the firing, right, the forced resignation of my senior colleague of color. Secondly, they make it very clear to say that this director had to provide direction for the development of new exhibitions, outreach efforts, and education programs to ensure the best museum practices are employed. That's the wrong, oh, it moved the highlight. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong bullet point. So down one more, Patricia. Okay, so the director was supposed to maximize unique programmatic opportunities, working closely with the curatorial education and public programs divisions to animate the permanent collection galleries in innovative ways that attract a broader, more diverse audience while maintaining the museum's traditional core white audience. Right? So that goes viral. Goes viral because the New York Times reporter Sarah Barr, who broke it, also from Indianapolis, had gone to school, at IUPUI, so she was familiar with the problems, at the institution. And because of her, she tweeted, like after she published the article, she said, "This is exactly what Dr. Kelli Morgan was talking about 6 months ago." And from that point, the community outreach, or I should say the community network, or just the community movement was like, he got to go. Because I think I don't necessarily think people thought I was lying, when I resigned, because it is something that's so, it's not unique, right? It's something that's very ubiquitous to American art museums, or art museums in the States. But I think people thought I was exaggerating, and so when this happened, and his response to the New York Times was literally, "Oh, if we knew people were going to be upset about it, we just would have wrote it differently." And so the arrogance, right, was unbelievable. And at that point, for me, I was like, okay, there's something to, right, the way in which I've kind of worked through this institution. The way that I not just approach like putting the work up, right, and like my temperature taking, but there's like frameworks. And what I'm really doing is utilizing like civil rights grassroots organizing frameworks. I'm using 19th century Black abolitionist frameworks. And it just kind of dawned on me. And I said, okay, this is something you can teach. This is something that you can actually like kind of put together and develop a curriculum around, Kelly. And then I got this wonderful position here at Tufts, to do just that. So in closing, and I'll stop there and say that always, 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 stay true to the value systems that right? White supremacy will make you believe, because it's been so normalized that we're supposed to do this and that and every other thing in a particular way. And as people of color, like we have our own value systems. We have our own ontologies and epistemologies and ways of knowing that they know nothing about, that are so successful and that are like so important. And it's that work that we have to do in conjunction with showing work by non-white artists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kelli. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Kelli. So now we are open for questions. We can start with one from Sabrina Moura. Okay, it's a long one because the space for comments in YouTube, it limits the size of the comments, so it's broken down, but okay. So hello, Dr. Kelli. Thanks for such a necessary talk. Here in Brazil, we are experiencing a big, I don't know if that's what she said, but it's what's written.
Probably shift. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's actually shit. So, okay, so let's move on. A big shit in museums. And she's right. In terms of diversity politics, I am interested about the concept of white supremacy, since it has a huge historical weight often associated with far-right politics. However, it has been more and more used in academia as a concept and as an analytical tool, including art history. So my question is if you have been discussing white supremacy as a concept in art history. And the reason why I'm asking this is because I used it in my PhD dissertation and tried to retrace the uses of this concept.
Yes, Sabrina, thank you so much. That's a great question. And I have been. It's been this new rabbit hole that I have gone down because I started, and you may ask, and a lot of you on here tonight may know this, but it was news to me. It's like I discovered that the post-colonial scholars, mid 20th century to now, have been writing about the museum, right, as a like colonial repository. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh, like, where's this scholarship been all my life? And primarily Césaire, I was reading, discourse on colonialism and was like, oh my God, he was writing about the museum. And I just kind of kept going. And with that and watching Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, that, and then Dan Hicks' The Brutish Museums, right, which took me through the whole like cultural heritage, right, conversations. Mm-hmm. And I said, why are we not talking about art history as a discipline was created to maintain white supremacy? Like, it is the visual wing, of the colonial project. Winkelmann, right? I'm horrible at like my
Winkelmann, yes.
But like father of art history, Sabrina, right? Working in Germany, his whole thing is completely divorcing Greek and Roman neoclassicism from its Mediterranean and Middle Eastern, North African roots. So he completely erases Egypt, and again, Arabic influence, Islamic influence too, completely from Greek classical antiquity. And I was like, nobody thought that was interesting. Like, nobody thought that was a problem. And as I could, continue to kind of move through, because like I totally haven't done the research as much as I want to, right? Like, but this is like your question and like this particular issue is literally the basis of the curriculum that I'm building here at Tufts for curatorial studies. It's like how to look at the history of the art museum as a cultural repository for colonization, and for the larger colonial project. Colonial nations, not literally, right, but like killed all the people and took all the stuff and then built buildings and put it all on display. At some point, we need to talk about that, right? At some point we have to talk about how art history develops as a discipline to maintain that. Not to necessarily teach us how to like, draw and paint in great ways. Not that it doesn't do that too, right? But it had a broader systemic, and I would also say like crowd controlling type of functionality, which is why art history is having the problems, right, that is happening as a discipline right now. Which is why art museums are having the issues that they're having right now, right? These diversity initiatives aren't working. Hiring the curator of color, or maybe you hire 2 or 3. Maybe you acquire, several, works by artists of color. Maybe you have, repatriated works, but the issues still remain because the institution itself is not even a vestige of colonialism. It is an absolute representation, right? It is a living monument, to colonialism right now. And until we actually like really are honest with each other, and ourselves about that, and we start teaching the history in that way, we'll always have these issues. The diversity initiatives will never work, because just bringing us into the space. First of all, the spaces are violent and like dangerous for us anyway. And so, yeah, that is like totally like my bag that I have been in for the last maybe 6 to 8 months, just reading voraciously as much as I can, about the way that the origins of art history as a discipline in Germany and Austria contribute to like the structure of white supremacy overall.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if you have other questions from the audience. Claudia, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would love to ask a few questions. Thank you so much. You mentioned several times like the what you did with like writing and labels, and that really called my attention, because you also mentioned that you thought that the museum really did not produce labels at all, right? And this touches on, a kind of a discussion of label and curatorship. Should the work speak for itself, or the relations of work, or how important it is to really put like writing and explanations within the curator strategy? So I would really love to hear your opinion about that, specifically in this process of decolonizing or like redirecting a collection and a way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's imperative, Claudia, for the work that I do. I am totally familiar, with that approach, right, where people are just like, just kind of let it be, or pack it in. But because so much of what I do as a curator is this type of excavation work, I have to provide the context. So for instance, my colleague Tyler Green and I are working on a project called the Dark Water Project, where we're trying to do more of this excavation, of historic American art. And we were talking to a curator of American art at a particular institution recently about a William Wetmore Story's Cleopatra. And we're like, here is the letter that he writes, right, to Everett Hale about how he's making this work as a commentary on Black people not being qualified for American citizenship, right? Because this is like 1865, right? Between 1867, so post-Civil War. And how, so that's Cleopatra. Then he makes Libyan Sybil, right? And he writes another letter, to Harriet Beecher Stowe, telling her that he's making Sybil as this portent or ominous figure speaking to like the inevitable demise, right, of the African civilization. So we find all of this contextual, the letters themselves, but then also these contextual pieces of material culture, so what Story is looking at, right, while he's actually like making these two sculptures. And long story short, we get back our proposal from this particular curator, and he had literally taken all of that out. Right. And the excuse was, well, the gallery isn't big enough, to show all of these things. And we were just like, yep, nope, you don't get it. So it was a moment for me where I was like, God, into to a certain degree, like American curators trained in like historic American art, like don't have the faculties to even like see it, because we're not typically trained, in that way. And so Tyler said, yeah, we're gonna have to do a little bit, but we're gonna have to do a little bit more like reconnaissance, or like figure out like, how to like deliver it in a different way. And I said, no, we're gonna have to train. We're gonna have to retrain people. I said, and that's gonna take a minute. But that we had, right, like this is what the label copy, should say. This is the stuff that it should reference. And this is not like, because we're trying to build a community of practice, so this is not just the art museum. This brings in the archive in the area. This brings in the library in the area, other historical collections.
Mhm.
You know, some of that work can always be, you know, we got light issue, you know, right, light issues and stuff like that. So you have to rotate it. So you really do have to think about workload, but it forces the institution, right, to really rethink how it operates.
Mhm.
You know, and it's like that part, like that contextual work needs to be done because we've operated for almost 250 years as if art museums aren't history museums. You know, or like art objects don't hold particular histories, and they do.
Mhm.
Right? They always have. And so that's the type, you know, that label copy has to be there. Not so much to be, you know, like preaching to people, you know, but to really say, like, if we're gonna talk about not just like the problems in art museums, but if we're really gonna talk about, you know, decolonizing, you know, the way that we show work, we have to start with how, you know, the work participates in colonization in the first place. And to do that, you can't just use the work. You know, you have to use the artists. You have to use the people around the artists. You know, Story is an interesting figure because his father was on the Roger Taney court. So his father was a part of like the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, right? So he knows all this stuff is happening, right? He's influenced by these things. So yeah, for me, it's like, how do you put that? You know, you can't put that in like a 120 word label. But in IMA, what we were working on were other learning tools. You know, so audio, video. We had also worked on some projection mapping, right? So the way to put that information into like this fun kind of thing where like you've seen these things at airports, right? Where like you step on it and then it like does something cool. Okay. So it was like a projection map, like image, you know, on the floor that visitors could step on, and then it would like display, you know, all of these other reproductions, you know, of material culture, and then and audio that would just walk people through it, you know, whether it was my voice or somebody else's, you know, voice narrating it. We also we looked at some animation as well.
Sounds great.
I have a question. I don't know, Kelly, how familiar you are or not. But there, as you know, this is a movement happening in many museums and even very traditional museums, and there are more successful and less successful attempts to decolonize a collection, to present the collection or create an exhibition in a way that contextualizes the artworks. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, how do you feel? Can you give maybe some examples of attempts that were interesting, attempts that kind of didn't work? Because I have one example in my mind, which I found very interesting, and it caused some discomfort, to say the least, in the Netherlands, because it was an exhibition at the Maurits Ruiz, which is the housing of the collection of a colonizer in Brazil, that he spent some time colonizing the northern part of Brazil, and then he came back to the Netherlands, and his collection is housed in this old building that he had built for himself, his house. And they did an exhibition a couple of years ago, which I found very interesting. He has a big collection of landscape paintings from Franz Post, which is the artist that was in Brazil with him during his government in Brazil. And they are always very presented in a very neutral way. And they started this, as far as I know, temporary exhibition. I don't think it's like their regular display, but I found it interesting that they presented the paintings of the Brazilian landscape, and it showed many times some very rough, very small, like farmsteads starting in Brazil. And next to it, they presented receipts that they had just discovered from slave buying from Joran Moritz. And that was something that in the Netherlands was not very well known. And these documents were published, and they caused like this big uncomfortable situation. And the museum put the landscapes, the Frans Post landscapes next to the receipts from buying. So that I found was a very interesting way to say a lot without using like a huge label and explaining like a whole book around the painting. So I was a little bit curious about what kind of examples do you think are interesting or not?
It's so, again, like I'm a super spiritual person, and so I'm just like, you know, God and the universe is like so on point. I swear to God, Patricia, that catalog I've been reading it for the last 2 weeks.
Oh, from that exhibition?
Oh. Yes. I have been reading. My friend Diva, let me think. I can't think of what Diva's last name is. She works at Zumaya. She works at LACMA. And we had a conversation about this because, like I said, it's been a rabbit hole that I've been down. So I'm just like, does anybody else know about this? Like, you know, the question you just asked, right? Like, who else is doing this? And she sent me a bunch of stuff, and she sent me that catalog. One other thing that I've worked on recently is the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. So what they did, they were building a whole new building, right? And they went in same thing, moving from like a very kind of ritzy glitzy place in Center City, Philadelphia, which is primarily white, into South Kensington, Philadelphia, which is primarily Latinx and Black. So when they discovered, you know, they were going to have to move, they started just going to community, you know, like the state, because it was in Clay Studio is a small enough institution, so it was nimble enough. But the director of artistic programs, like their teaching artists, everybody, like they just started going to community orgs, meetings, right, at different orgs in South Kensington, and saying, hey, you know, we just bought this land here. We don't want to come in as like the Clay Studio and like, you know, bestow all of our, you know, great art, you know, onto the people of South Kensington. We want to be what you need. So what's happening now? What's working? What doesn't work? What could our resources help with? What do we need to completely stay out of? This is 2022, 5 years. They started having those conversations with those communities in 2016. And the building opens in like 3 weeks. And we did, I'm the project evaluator on like the opening exhibition. It's called Making Place Matter. So through the idea of place, because the South Kensington, like the Latinx community is huge, so it's Ecuadorian and Colombian and Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican. So we did all of these different, you know, interpretations, you know, the exhibition title. There's a large Arabic community, so we produce materials in Arabic. We did the community council thing, but it's a huge council of people. Huge. And we got together, you know, once every maybe like 6 to 8 weeks, and we would have, and this was all Zoom, because it was, you know, middle of COVID, and we would do art activities together. So, you know, they would send us, you know, they mailed us all, you know, these little wads of clay, and we would make cups or bowls or tiles or whatever. And in that time, we would always start the meeting and say, you know, what's somebody's moment of joy? So we would share our moments of joy. You know, we talk about our pets, you know, we would meet people's families, you know, and it built this bond, you know, where the community now feels like the institution is theirs, right? And that stake. So the other two things that worked really well, you know, for what you're talking about, is that community council members, like if they wanted to, everybody didn't show up, but we worked with the social justice leaning or committed is a better word, design studio. So community members design all of the gallery furniture.
Oh.
Yeah. So it was like designed and actually made, right? So like the company's called Tiny WPA, so they fabricated it, and then everybody came together and then they actually like built, like they built the benches, and they built the pedestals. And then we did a label writing exercise at the end, like mid-February, so we went through a series of exercises that we used to use in Newfields, where the community wrote the labels for the artworks in the gallery. So there's very little curatorial like I've always call it curatorial scaffolding, right? But like not like a full on, curatorial voice. So it's not like here's the curator's label and here's the community's label. Like it's one label, like written from everybody. So that was a way that like an institution kind of literally recreated itself, literally putting the community, at the center. So it's really great when I talk to some of the folks and they're just like, it's so cool because it's like, it's like my neighbor, I can like, go into the gallery and not just see myself, but like see something that I did and I'm not an artist, so it's that kind of thing. And like I said, they were small enough, to do that. Like hell would freeze over before the Met could do something like that, right? Right. But the Morty's catalog has been like, it's like so highlighted, up. Because I think I'm going to teach it in the fall.
Oh, nice. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. I think I have to choose because Camila here sent like 2 questions. So let's choose one so we don't go too much over time. So she says, hello, Dr. Kelli Morgan. It was a pleasure to hear you. I believe that the discussion in the United States is at a different point compared to Brazil. The effort of some institutions are still limited to offering a day for diversity in museums and art institutions. How do you see efforts to write on art history that goes beyond what is traditionally seen in art history and museology? So let's stick with that one.
Okay. And like you said, Camila, in the States, that's happening. They're and particularly in Latinx, Latin American, pre-Columbian, pre-Columbian art. I think there's much more of it happening in those areas, in art history, than European art, or American art. And in contemporary, I think it's being, I think, unfairly placed, on contemporary artists of color, where institutions are like, here is all of our colonial issues, Titus Kaphar, come in and like do it's the Fred Wilson, mine in the museum, right? I call it like the Fred Wilson. I hate to call it a curse, but it's like, it's like it's a hamster wheel. It's like Fred did that, project. It was phenomenal. He did it at so many different places, but it never actually like shifted curatorial approach, right? It never actually shifted the writing of art history. It wound up becoming this thing or this method, that institutions used when it kind of found itself in trouble, right? With its own institutional history. And I think it's become like almost epidemic. So it still has a ways to go, in terms of art history, in the States. But I think, my Latinx colleagues, and my Native American colleagues are definitely getting pieces out, that are writing against it, in a way that like in my world of historical American art, like doesn't really exist, to be honest. It really doesn't. It's just not there. And there are people who have tried to put like because there's a gatekeeping kind of thing that happens in American art where the senior people are in positions for like 30, 40 years. and that's on the journals, you know, in the museums. So I would say like last 2 to 3 years, myself included, there's been many of us who've been trying to publish, but can't get our work out. You know, because like I actually had a reviewer tell me that I couldn't write about a particular American artist in the way that I was writing about, because I was writing against the traditional art historical narrative. And it was like, you can't write this like this. You know, take this part out and we'll publish it. So like I was saying about the curator earlier, where it was like just completely took everything, you know, all the contextual work, you know, to Claudia's question earlier, like they just take it out. And so that's something that Darkwater is trying to address, you know, is to create some publication opportunities, you know, for those of us who actually do want to do this work. Because I think, like I said, it's harder for those of us that are outside, you know, of Latin American and Latinx and Native American and pre-Columbian.
I see. Okay, thank you so much, Kelli, for your great talk. It was really interesting. And we are now concluding this NEANE lecture. Stay tuned for our advertisements for our next events. And I wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelli. Thank you, Patricia. See you soon. Bye. Thank you, everyone.